Hey everyone, Stories Lost is back. Some events seem to link together despite their geographical distance. This time we explore two European cases, separated by hundreds of kilometers. Yet they strike us as uncannily similar. Perhaps you will agree. Perhaps you will insist on keeping them apart. In a small village in southeastern Denmark and in a hillside village in southern France, two retired men were roused before dawn by something they could not name. Both their homes were standalone, each facing open land. What they described was simple enough. A sudden light, unnatural stillness, and a sequence of sounds and impressions unlike anything they had experienced prior. And when morning came, it became clear that their rooftops, untouched the day before, were marked by a strange presence. On the 20th of November 1994, the Danish organization Scandinavian UFO Information, or SUFOI, received a phone call from a 65-year-old pensionist from Stensved, just outside Vordingborg. We will call him CP. He had something unusual to report. Not just a light in the sky, but a sequence of events that began on the night of Sunday the 14th of November and continued into the early morning of Tuesday the 16th. CP had been sitting up late that Sunday evening, playing a quiet game of solitaire. It was just after midnight, now early Monday morning, when he decided to go to bed. His house lies on the edge of town, and the bedroom window faces a green area by a fruit orchard. Behind that are open fields. As he lay in bed, he glanced out of the window, as he often did, to check for wild cats that sometimes roamed near the terrace. But this night, something else caught his attention. Around 10 minutes after lying down, he saw a figure running past the garden, no more than 5 meters from the window. It was about 140 to 150 centimeters tall and had light-colored hair. The figure was wearing something he later described as a dark phantom suit, some kind of tight-fitting clothing. It struck him as odd. Children and young people rarely wandered around that area at night, especially not in the middle of the week. At the same time, or just after, his eyes were drawn to a beam of light in, or just behind the orchard. He estimated the distance to be between 100 and 200 meters. It looked like a spotlight, pointing straight downward. The light made no sense. There was no vehicle, no sound, no movement apart from what he had just seen that could explain its origin. After that, nothing more happened. Not until the next day. Early Tuesday morning, on the 16th of November, at 4:45, CP woke up and was just about to get out of bed to use the toilet. That is when he heard a sound. It was like a Ronson lighter being scraped along a brick wall. A short, hard, metallic sound, and then something else. The sound lasts 2 to 3 seconds and comes from somewhere up on the roof. Then a smell. Sharp, unfamiliar, not smoke, not gas, but something entirely foreign. It filled the room briefly, and then it was gone. There was no damage, no obvious trace. He got up, went over to the window and pulled the curtain aside. At that exact moment, a brilliant beam of light switched on, hitting the terrace tiles just in front of the window. The beam was perfectly round, about a meter across, and so bright that it hurt to look at. It came from above at an angle. For a brief moment he felt afraid, but after 4 or 5 seconds the light shifted. It turned a rusty red color, then faded, and disappeared. He dressed quickly and went first to the terrace door, then to the front door, but he could see nothing outside. After that, he went to the bathroom window, opened it carefully, and leaned out as far as he could. That's when he caught another strange smell. It was strong, metallic, and hot. He described it as the smell of hot metal, or metal that was boiling. Nothing else happened after that. Shaken, he returned to bed. In the morning, CP went out into the garden to take a closer look. When he looked up at the roof, he noticed something new. 2 black streaks ran down the southern side of the roof tiles. He was certain they had not been there before. The roof was only a few years old and clean, with no moss or algae in that area. The streaks were 3 to 4 meters long, about the width of a single tile, and they were spaced evenly, 1 meter apart. The final incident settled it for Mr. CP. The impression it left stayed with him, and he kept turning it over in his mind, again and again, like a knot he could not untie. 5 days later, he picked up the phone and told the story exactly as he remembered it to SUFOI. Within a few days, he received visits from Erling Hageland from Odense and Toke Hounstrup from Lyngby. By the time the investigators arrived on site with the witness, the traces had faded to a gray-greenish color and were not as prominent as the witness had seen them on Wednesday, November 16th. In connection with their visit to Mr. CP, a report on the incident was written, and samples were taken from the traces on the roof, along with a standard reference sample. They also contacted the military authorities in the area. Neither the Stensved Home Guard nor the Vordingborg barracks had conducted exercises at the relevant times. There had also been no outdoor scout activity in the area. The investigators now turned their attention to the contextual clues of the events. CP's first observation was the sweeping cone of light seen through a group of trees. He was used to seeing headlights from cars that occasionally drove along a small gravel road behind the orchard. He stated that this unfamiliar beam of light moved horizontally at a height of 5 or 6 meters above the road and followed the contour of a hillside in a field located beyond the orchard. That field had already been sown with winter grain, and for that reason, it was considered unlikely that the farmer would have been driving there in November. The sighting of the figure, what CP described as a boy, had several weak points. He only caught a brief glimpse, and there were no streetlights or similar sources of illumination that could have lit the person. Therefore, it is entirely possible, the investigators noted, that the figure could have been a boy on his way home who had taken a shortcut across the shared grassy area that borders CP's garden. One might object that it was a bit late for a boy to be walking around that area on a Monday in the small hours, but that detail alone does not rule out the possibility. The investigators gave particular attention to what might seem like the more elusive aspects of the case. The sound on the roof, the concentrated beam of light, and the brief but distinct metallic smell. None of these had left any physical trace. Could the witness's vivid perception of these specific qualities be accounted for by anything readily available in the immediate environment? They began with the sound. One possibility was that it had been caused by an animal, perhaps a bird landing on the roof or a small creature moving through the attic. But none of those scenarios fit. Birds such as crows or rooks are not active at night, and the house was recently built, which made it unlikely that something like a marten or a rat had made its way through the structure to reach the attic. The investigators approached the light in the same way, testing it against practical possibilities. A flare or similar device would have illuminated the entire garden, not produced a sharply defined 1-meter circle on the terrace. A car headlamp powered by a battery, or even a carbon arc lamp running from household current, might produce that effect in theory. But the idea that someone had climbed onto a roof at 4:45 in the morning to switch on a powerful light for only 5 seconds, then leave no trace behind, was judged to be extremely unlikely. Then there was the smell. CP described it as similar to a burned clutch, something hot and metallic. The investigators noted the detail carefully. They found no ordinary explanation for such an odor to appear and vanish without source or residue, especially in a quiet residential area where no machinery was in use. The conclusion was that these elements could not be linked to any known environmental or technical cause. They were accepted as part of the witness account and recorded as unexplained. As a part of the investigation, a material sample was scraped directly from one of the black streaks on the roof, and a second sample was taken from a clean section as a control. Both were analyzed and compared. In one, Part of the material was analyzed under a microscope by zoologist Lars Thomas from Valby. In the other, the samples were tested using X-ray fluorescence analysis, a method that can reveal the elemental composition of the material. These analyses were carried out with the assistance of Associate Professor Jens Larsen at the Department of Physics at the Royal Veterinary and Agricultural University in Frederiksberg. The method used was not fully quantitative, but it gave a reliable indication of the relative differences between the two samples. The method is especially sensitive to heavier elements, and the results were shown on a logarithmic scale. This means that even small differences between the two samples appeared clearly in the data. The trace sample showed elevated levels of sulfur, potassium, and bromine. Among these, the presence of bromine was the most notable, although still measured only in millionths of a gram. It appeared in higher concentration than in the control sample. Still, the analysis had its limits. The control sample consisted of fired clay, which already contains a broad range of natural elements, including various metals. That made it difficult to detect whether the trace sample contained unusual metal content, since this type of method cannot isolate small variations with precision. For now, let's leave it at that and move on to our next case. In southern France, in the Tarn region, just outside the small village of Bertre, something happened in the early hours of September 4th, 1989. It was a quiet hillside community, the kind of place where change comes slowly, and people notice when it does. François Aujoulet, a 68-year-old man from Toulouse and a recently retired commercial director, had moved into the area with his wife just 2 months earlier. They were living at the end of a sloping road in a country house, partly covered in Virginia creeper and surrounded by open countryside. He was in bed that morning just after 4 o'clock when something strange woke him. Not a sound, but light. I was dozing, lying on my left side. Suddenly there were beams of headlights everywhere, he said. When I turned to look, what I saw made no sense. The shutters were open, and I saw an intense light in the alfalfa field. It was 4 in the morning. Curious, I went outside and walked toward the blinding beam of light. My dog Rex followed me. As I got closer, I saw a strange luminous square, about 10 meters by 10. It was brighter than broad daylight inside it, and I am certain you could have seen an ant crawling. The edge of the square was just a few centimeters from my feet. There was no heat, but I didn't dare step into it. The light, an unbearable white, resembled the glare of a halogen lamp. Still, I didn't dare go near it. It wasn't that I was afraid, but I was completely fascinated by what I was seeing. I turned around to go back inside. That's when I saw a luminous object on the ridge of the roof. There was still no sound. I could now make out a shape that resembled a gas cylinder, covered in dazzling facets. The object continued to project its beam toward the alfalfa field. Its size was about 2.5 meters by 3, and it remained motionless for around 30 seconds. Suddenly, the beams of light and the object went dark. Then nothing. It took me a few minutes to get back to the house, because the darkness was thick, the new moon providing barely any light. Back home, I drank a large glass of water. I went back upstairs to go to bed, and in the bedroom, my wife asked me why I was up. I told her what I had just seen. For a week, he hesitated to talk about what he had seen. This man, who had his feet firmly on the ground, was afraid that people in the village would make fun of him. Eventually, he consulted the mayor, who advised him to speak to the gendarmes. That is what he did, and on Tuesday, September 12th, they came to examine the house. But they did not come alone. They had taken his account seriously and were accompanied by scientists from the CNES field unit and by members of SEPRA, the service responsible for the analysis of atmospheric re-entry phenomena. For 2 days, all of these experts carried out numerous investigations. The story quickly spread among the neighboring villages. "I can't take a step in Puy-Lorenz without someone asking me about that famous night," said the retired man with a touch of humor, now an unwilling protagonist in this still unexplained event. That Tuesday morning, his nearby neighbors stood at their windows, watching the strange dance of a helicopter circling over the Aujoulet home. Later, When interviewed by journalists, Mr. Aujoulet pointed directly to the spot. "It was like a helicopter that doesn't make any noise," he said, "and it was full of light, like a floodlight." "They told me not to say anything until they were finished," he said, offering the comment like an apology to the first journalists who came, referring to instructions from SEPRA personnel. It was clear to the journalists that the gendarmes and members of SEPRA were busy on site. "At this stage of the investigation, we cannot say anything," said Jean-Jacques Velasco, the head of the agency, as he surveyed the scene. "Our task is to gather all the information and all the facts relating to this phenomenon." But the journalists could also not help but notice the state of the roof, and that didn't require an interview. And they were not alone, because Mr. Aujoulet had of course noticed it too. The very next morning, as he stepped into his garden, he saw that the tiles on the section of roof above where he had seen the object were browner than the others, and clearly displaced. As it were, the day before the incident, the homeowner had placed containers to guard against damage from the heavy storm that had passed through on Sunday evening. Still, it was impossible not to notice that the roof tiles near the chimney now showed two distinct colorations. Over an area of about 25 square meters of the roof, the curved tiles had changed color, as if they had been burned. Some had even been lifted. In addition, the small mosses that had been growing on the tiles in that area had turned black, whereas before they had been green. Stranger still, the part of the roof where the luminous object is believed to have landed had sunk by several centimeters. This was confirmed by the roofer, who had recently repaired the house. The contractor who carried out the roof repairs confirmed that the tiles had been twisted in a clockwise direction over a length of 3 to 5 meters, and that the ridge of the roof was sagging at the spot where the object had been observed. Inevitably, the ruckus of abnormal activity had attracted the attention of both neighbors and journalists, and Mr. Aujoulet could not help but feel uneasy whenever he encountered them. One detail struck him as an odd coincidence. The house had previously been inhabited by a high-ranking police official responsible for security in France for former Iranian Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar. The retired man now wondered whether this detail might have any bearing on what had happened. The luminous phenomenon had clearly disrupted his routines, but in the end, the commotion around his property may have been just as striking as the strange object itself. "I don't know what's going to happen now, or who's going to pay for my roof. It certainly won't be the state, and even less the insurance. I'd be surprised if you found whoever was responsible," he said with a touch of humor to the SEPRA representative. "And if the object came back?" a journalist asked him. "I'd do the same thing all over again," replied François. Mr. Aujoulet was not the only one the journalists got their claws into. One of the scientists who had come to the site to assess whether the event might correlate with other cases also spoke to the press. As he said, without wanting to go into further detail, "For once there are traces." In a later statement, Jean-Jacques Velasco added, "We will analyze in detail using sophisticated methods the evidence we have collected," explained the head of SEPRA. "We regularly investigate similar phenomena, which all in all are not very different from those previously observed by other witnesses. But here, without a doubt, what draws all of our attention is the presence of physical traces," he said. Indeed, the evidence confirms it. Tiles were lifted, and in the middle of the roof, some of them appear to have changed color. Is this alteration one of the consequences of the luminous phenomenon? Other troubling signs, such as the roof frame having shifted slightly, raise questions or leave observers perplexed. The presence of plant moss on the roof and its near total disappearance in the area where the object is thought to have hovered is also strange. Nothing will be overlooked, and all the evidence will be thoroughly examined, using methods such as thermoluminescence and spectrometry in the lab. They expect it will take about 6 months before they can obtain any results. We have no a priori assumptions. We do not know what it is. There are phenomena. That is all. Finally, a confession escaped his lips, almost despite himself. There is probably something there. The official investigation into the Bertre incident, led by SEPRA, proved comprehensive. A helicopter was deployed to survey the area, and ground teams collected samples under difficult conditions, including moss and roof tiles from the scorched section of the house. However, the presence of national and regional press disrupted parts of the operation, but the work continued. From the outset, SEPRA ruled out familiar explanations. This was not a helicopter, not the moon, not a balloon caught in the wind. What remained, they concluded, were two possibilities. Either the witness had invented the story, or he had encountered something unknown. Only the laboratory analysis of the biological and physical samples could resolve the question. According to the gendarmerie, Mr. Aujoulet was the only person to report a luminous phenomenon in the area that night. As for himself, he pointed out that before this experience, he didn't really believe in UFOs. To the weekly tabloid France Dimanche, Mr. Aujoulet stated, "People laugh and some think I'm crazy. In any case, I can say one thing. What I saw, I'm sure of it. I'm certain I wasn't the victim of an illusion. But to say I received a visit from extraterrestrials? There's no way. I've never believed in that, and I don't believe it anymore now. The existence of spacecraft from another world? No, a number of other hypotheses are possible. One might think of ultra-secret military craft or prototypes based on magnetic levitation. But for the moment, we have to wait for the conclusions of the experts, if they are ever made public. After all, some things are perhaps meant to remain secret." At least one part of the story seemed at first to be heading toward a reassuring resolution. "They will fix my roof for me," François jubilated. "A brand new roof." He initially seemed confident he would be reimbursed, but over the following years it becomes clear from news clippings and from the bulletin Ufomania, which returned in 1994 to photograph the house again, that this never happened. SEPRA removed around 100 scorched tiles for analysis, and Mr. Aujoulet was left to cover the cost of emergency roof repairs himself, an expense that came to 30,000 francs. According to the bulletin Ufomania, what followed in the years after the initial event was in many ways even more astonishing. Mr. Aujoulet now told them that after the strange affair with the luminous cylinder, he went on to witness a dozen further sightings. On 4 occasions, he even managed to photograph what appeared to be the same phenomenon repeating itself. A sphere illuminating the surrounding fields, as if searching for something. In April 1992, he reported seeing 2 large triangular objects landed on the side of a hill just 200 meters from his home. The UFO phenomenon no longer surprised him. He knew it existed, even if he still had no clear understanding of what it truly was. To wrap things up, whether one agrees or not, what we believe connects these 2 cases across both time and geographical distance are 3 core similarities. First, the witnesses. In both Denmark and France, the reports came from retired men living on the edge of town, in houses facing open land. They were not seekers of attention, not known to be prone to exaggeration. They gave clear, consistent descriptions of what they experienced and maintained an open attitude throughout. Second, the physical traces. In Denmark, streaks appeared on a section of roof that had been clean the day before. The tiles were only a few years old, and the rest of the roof showed no signs of moss or weathering. The marks were sampled, analyzed, and documented by SUFOI. In Bertre, the tiles were visibly warped. The ridgeline had partially collapsed, the moss had turned black, and several square meters beneath showed clear deformation. A contractor who had worked on the house confirmed that the damage was new. In both cases, samples were taken under supervision and sent for analysis. Third, the light. In both cases, the encounter began with light of unusual intensity and movement. At Stensved, a sharply bounded beam roughly a meter wide illuminated the terrace in front of the bedroom window, coming in from an angle above. In Bertre, an intense white glow lit up the field outside and woke the witness through an open window. Whatever its source, the light displayed a quality unlike anything the men had encountered before. However, the differences are just as important. In Denmark, the physical traces were ultimately downplayed by analysts, with no clear conclusion. In France, The investigation by SEPRA remained open, and the results of the analysis was never divulged. The case was classified as Type D, unexplained after complete inquiry, and remains on record. So is it possible to connect these events? The symmetry between them suggests there is something worth paying attention to. Encounters like these may not offer clear answers, but they can follow certain patterns. We might ask ourselves, when physical traces are found, do they deepen our willingness to ponder, or do we hand over the questions to experts? Because even when evidence is gathered and analyzed, the scientific answer is only ever the scientific answer, bound to what can be measured or compared. It may rule out one thing or point toward another, but it does not always close the case. Why is it possible for evidence to pull us back into doubt, even when uncertainty lingers or when earthly explanations are proposed but never fully fit? As always here on Stories Lost, feel free to draw your own conclusions. Where does this evidence land with you? Are you inclined to make the connection? Also, if you like this video and want to support the channel, drop us a like. And if you don't want to miss future episodes, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. As always, we want to thank our ongoing supporters. See you next Friday.